But for all of the major sponsors right now, there's a very interesting backdrop going on about protests and, of course, you know, quite a big sort of local backlash about the cost of the stadia. So the challenge for the brands to get it right in the current context is probably even tougher than they've ever been used to.
Yeah, does that mean they've really got to stick to the game? We did a segment about McDonald's commercial, which is doing really well, where it was all of these people, you know, doing amazing things with soccer balls. You didn't really, or footballs. You didn't really see the brand that much. It was really about the game. Is that the safest road to take for these sponsors when there is a lot of controversy surrounding an event?
Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, when you look at it from outside Brazil, I think it's very difficult to try and, you know, get your little piece of the World Cup, so to speak. But when you're inside Brazil, it's very different.
How so?
I think what the Brazilians are looking for is for the teams, for the sponsors and for everybody who's coming in the country to really engage with them and show that they care. There's a lot of political unrest at the moment, as we know. It seems like after yesterday, Brazil is finally in the spirit of the thing. But I think the sponsors that will win out with the Brazilians will be the ones that show that they really care about Brazil as much as they care about football.
Hi there, I'm Jared Howard.
And I'm Robert Nisbet.
You're tuned into Video Radio, where we take a look at the world issues, problems, and protests that are not being covered by mainstream media.
As you saw in the previous clip, the corporate sponsors of FIFA or the World Cup are having some issues with getting their message out.
Yes, their message being, of course, we support 250,000 evictions around the World Cup site and the way that Brazil is driving its entire economy into the ground while supporting a sports spectacular.
Yeah, the news has been full of a litany of issues around the World Cup, especially the issues of pushing people out and people rebelling against the high ticket prices and security issues as well.
So we've got video right here for you about the World Cup and the story that's not being told on major media. Thanks for tuning in to Video Radio. Check this out.
Today is the fourth day of the World Cup in Brazil, but it was the first game in Rio. Many of those chanting in the streets are not supporting a team. Elaine Quijano is there.
There were protests across Brazil today. In Brasilia, anti-World Cup demonstrators gathered at a bus stop and marched to the stadium. And in Rio, demonstrators gathered in a park before blocking a street leading to Maracanã, the stadium where the final will be played. Among the protesters today was Rodrigo Modenesa. He came here today to document what was happening in the hope that the world would take notice.
We don't understand why the government used so much money in these stadiums and did not employ this money on education, health, and other problems, you know.
Long security lines prevented thousands of angry soccer fans from entering the stadium in Brasilia. Some fans missed the entire first half of the match between Ecuador and Switzerland. Tomorrow's headache could be water. In Natal, the city where the U.S. will play its debut game, officials have declared a flood alert. Today, Team USA prepared for their match against Ghana.
So not being covered on major media.
No, they're covering the scores and the teams and the goals, but that's about it.
And it's kind of interesting that we've got 250,000 evictions right now, and they have no hope of paying this off. A lot of people on the inside of the economy is saying, well, they're just waiting for Brazil to go totally bankrupt so they can buy the country at 10 cents on the dollar.
Well, you know the World Cup's not about the people anyway, it's about the corporations.
Did we say that out loud? That was out loud, right? Okay. So, continuing stuff out loud that they don't want us to talk about.
Yeah, there's some issues going on in Egypt.
Issues. I like it. Just a nice way to say issues that are happening in Egypt. The story is not being covered, so let's start off with the spotlight.
Well, we turn now to Brazil, where thousands of police officers joined bus drivers for day 2 of a massive strike in Sao Paulo, just weeks before the country is set to host the World Cup. The workers are demanding better wages. They were met by tear gas when they faced off with strikebreakers. This follows last week's walkout by military police in Recife, another World Cup host city, which drew a crackdown by National Guard and Army troops.
Meanwhile, more than 10,000 people have occupied a major lot next to one of the arenas that will host the World Cup's opening match. They call their protest the People's Cup, and they're opposing the nearly $500 million spent on the stadium, even as their communities lack adequate hospitals and schools. Demonstrations throughout the country have called attention to similar concerns. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Dave Zirin, sports columnist for The Nation, host of Edge of Sports Radio and SiriusXM. Talk about what's happening in Brazil right now.
Absolutely. Like a friend of mine who's living in Brazil right now, my friend Dylan, he just emailed me to say that the word FIFA, and that's the acronym for the International World Soccer Organization, the word FIFA is about as popular in Brazil as FEMA was in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. In a recent online poll in Brazil, only 22% of people in the country are even going to root for Brazil during the World Cup. I mean, the amount of dissatisfaction with what FIFA has done in conjunction with the Workers' Party is reaching historic heights. Yet this is the first time, really since 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, that you have seen mass demonstrations in advance of the event itself. And that's what makes this historic, and that's why the whole world is watching Brazil right now.
So, with this kind of media...
Yeah, that was, well, that was kind of an older story.
Yeah.
That came up before or just after the mass sentencing of all the activists, sentencing them to death.
Yeah.
And John Kerry went over there to try and talk things over with the Egyptian government, and then the journalism trial happens.
Yes, and this journalism trial, this is another thing that you'd think major media would be splashing all over the place with big dramatic music. Instead, they're covering a dog that got trapped on the side of a mountain.
Well, there has been some response from the media, and that's a good thing.
So let's check this out.
You've probably heard by now, an Egyptian court recently sentenced 683 people to death in a trial denounced by much of the international community as a sham. And that includes the Obama administration, which called the verdict unconscionable. Thing is, that verdict came less than a week after the administration announced it would resume sending $650 million in military aid to Egypt. That aid was originally put on hold after Egypt's military overthrew Mohamed Morsi, the country's first democratically elected president, and then brutally suppressed protesters calling for his return. That unrest is still ongoing, but the State Department has now eased restrictions on funding to be used for Egypt's border security and counterterrorism programs. Plenty of observers have taken the administration to task for releasing the aid in light of heavy-handed moves like the mass death sentence, saying it looks like the U.S. cares more about Egypt's strategic value than its democracy.
So right now, Obama is trying to tell Egypt, you need to show me progress. But these types of incidents and these types of rulings tend to undermine that.
U.S. Senator Patrick Leahy would probably agree with that statement. He's vowed to block assistance to Egypt's military until he sees evidence the country is on the path to democracy.
Nobody can justify this. It does not show democracy. It shows a dictatorship run amok.
But not according to Egyptian Foreign Minister Nabil Fahmy. During his recent meeting with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, he argued Egypt's government was completely independent of its judicial system. Fahmy also pointed to the country's upcoming presidential and parliamentary elections as evidence Egypt is committed to democracy. Egypt's former military general Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is all but guaranteed to win. The Obama administration has not commented directly on Leahy's statements, but a spokesperson told Voice of America White House officials will update Congress as the aid moves forward. For Newsy, I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, multiple sources, a broader view.
The U.S. just gave the Egyptian military $572 million, and Secretary of State John Kerry is defending that decision now.
Well, we've actually reduced our aid. We are not providing aid directly to the government. We provide aid to the military.
That's a different message than he gave just this past Sunday while in Cairo, a day before the verdict, where he heralded President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's commitment to human rights and U.S. aid.
President Obama and the administration have proposed providing the full amount of aid, the $650 million.
On Tuesday, Congressman Adam Schiff proposed a bill to dramatically reduce the aid given to Egypt in the future. It failed, but he's promising to keep trying.
The writing is on the wall. It cannot continue to imprison protesters and journalists.
The most powerful man in the U.S. Senate calling for their immediate release.
Even though the president of Egypt today said he wasn't going to interfere, I would hope that the process will allow relief to be given to these people who are simply trying to do their jobs.
U.S. officials have made it clear they believe these three are paying a horrible price for doing their jobs. And now the question is being asked, will Egypt pay a price for locking them up because of it?
Okay, so yes, that's true. The major media has covered it a little bit, but locally, our news headline at the local newspaper was "Dog trapped on side of mountain. Here is 6 minutes about the search and rescue operation."
Yeah.
For a pet.
Of course, the ironic thing about this Egypt situation is Obama has just released $500 million in further aid to the Egyptian military government.
So coming up in the next segment, as we continue on, we're going to be talking about the journalists and the specific issues surrounding Egypt and our continued support of a military regime. I am Darren Howard.
And I am Robert Nisbet.
Okay, so after this lack of commercial messages,
we'll be right back.
In one way or another, money affects almost everything that happens on the planet. If we want to deal with the big social, economic, and environmental challenges that we're facing today, changing the nature of the money we use is where we have to start. Right now, we have a problem. More than 97% of all the money in our economy is created by banks when they make loans. Most of this money goes into house price bubbles and gambling on financial markets. This has led to ever-widening inequality, the highest personal debt in history, and house prices that very few people can afford, before even mentioning the financial crisis. But 3 simple changes to the way that money and banking works could make a huge difference. These 3 changes would give us a more stable economy, with more jobs, less personal and government debt, and a solid footing to begin tackling the environmental crisis. So, what do we need to do? Firstly, we need to take the power to create money away from the banks and return it to a democratic, accountable, and transparent process. History has shown that when banks have the power to create money, they create too much in the good times, causing financial crises, and too little in the bad times, making recession and unemployment even worse. They put most of the money that they create into house price bubbles and financial speculation, and only a small amount into businesses outside the financial sector. We simply don't think that we can trust banks, who are hardwired to chase short-term profits, with something as powerful as the ability to create money. And it's not enough to regulate them. Regulators have repeatedly failed to keep banks under control. There's no reason why they should get it right this time around. But we can't trust politicians with the keys to the printing press any more than we can trust the big banks. Instead, we need a new committee that decides whether and when to create new money. This committee would need to be accountable to Parliament and sheltered from vested interests. They would ensure the right amount of money is created, not enough to cause bubbles in a financial crisis, but not so little that it causes a recession. Secondly, we want to see money created free of debt. Right now, banks create money when they make loans, which means that for every pound in your bank account, someone else must be a pound in debt. It means that almost all the money in the economy is effectively on loan from the banks, and we have to pay interest on nearly every pound that exists. If we try to pay down our debts, money disappears from the economy, making it harder for others to repay their own debt. Instead of letting banks create our money, the state could create it, free of debt. And instead of lending money into the economy through mortgages and loans, it could be spent into the economy. This means that new debt-free money would stimulate the real economy, create jobs, and make it possible for ordinary people to start paying down their debts. Finally, we want to see money come into the real economy before it reaches financial markets and property bubbles. If newly created money was used to fund public spending or cut taxes for ordinary people, then that money would start its life in the real economy. It would create jobs and support businesses, instead of getting trapped in financial and property markets. There are real challenges facing us over the next 40 years, such as how to provide for a growing population, a changing climate, and increasingly scarce natural resources. Right now, it's impossible to solve these problems because money, which affects almost every aspect of our lives, is broken. We need to fix it and get a money system that works for society rather than against it.